All right, so this is 10.3, and it's titled The Future of Biodiversity. So the objectives for this lecture is going to be list and describe 4 types of efforts to save individual species, explain the advantages of protecting entire ecosystems rather than individual species, describe the main provisions of the Endangered Species Act, discuss ways in which efforts to protect endangered species can lead to controversy, and then describe 3 examples of worldwide cooperative efforts to prevent extinctions. So saving one species at a time. This is kind of maybe the most narrow-minded view of trying to save a species, and that's just, as the name would suggest, where you find a species that's on the verge of extinction, and you take that species and you put them in an isolated area where they can survive and they can reproduce, and then you try and bring them back into the wild. And you kind of hope that once you put them back in the wild that they just kind of survive on their own again. So programs that that do this would be called a captive breeding program. And it's just, you're taking that species, you're breeding them in captivity, and then you just kind of hope that they can make it again once you put them back into the natural habitat. The question that gets raised with this is, if these species were already losing numbers in their habitat, what makes you think that just putting them back into the habitat after you've restored their numbers, what makes you think that all of a sudden that they're going to be able to survive and not just, become extinct again? It's kind of like, in some ways Einstein's definition of insanity, where you keep doing the same thing over and over again expecting a different result. However, there are times where it's been successful, and the biggest example is the California condor. Another way that you can preserve biodiversity is going to be literally taking the DNA from via seeds in plants, or sperm, eggs, or just pure DNA, and taking that DNA called germplasm and just storing it into these banks where you can keep that DNA for future use and research, or for trying to hopefully have the technology to recover those species. So it's this is almost a little bit more of like a last-ditch, maybe doomsday type effort. I know it's a big thing for plants, especially, where there's like a seed bank where most every species of plant that we use for agriculture in the world, or for research, they have these seeds stored in some sort of bank somewhere in case for whatever reason that plant gets pushed to extinction, so that we have some remaining seeds that we can use to regrow that plant and use it for research or for agricultural purposes. Kind of going back to the idea of the single species effort, is the idea of zoos, aquariums, and parks and gardens. And so these are useful because, I don't know, plants and animals are fun to go look at. People like going to zoos and seeing the different types of animals, or going to aquariums and seeing the different types of fishes. And they also can be useful because you can take endangered species and you can provide them with a controlled, protected area where these animals can be guaranteed to reproduce, and there'll at least be some remaining animals that survive. However, these facilities are expensive and they take up space and resources, and so they're this isn't a reliable model to protect all the world's rare and threatened species. And again, ultimately, saving a few individuals just isn't likely to preserve an entire species. Also what happens is, even if you take a few individuals and you can get them into a small population again, it's important to remember that small populations are especially vulnerable to infectious diseases. In small populations, they're going to be susceptible to inbreeding, where there's not as many mating partners, and so you're going to have individuals breeding with individuals that are similar to themselves, and so you run the risk of sort of concentrating different genetic disorders in these small populations. So these are kind of more of a last resort effort to save a species. They're not any means of a first step kind of conservation approach. It's a last resort. the most effective way is going to be to protect these species habitats. As we mentioned in 10.2, the previous PowerPoint, about 75% of loss of biodiversity is caused by the loss of habitats. So kind of the opposite of that is protecting habitats and not losing those habitats. However, this is a complicated approach to doing things because that takes a lot of time and effort and loss of valuable land to just mark that land off as protected habitat for a species. And oftentimes just picking out a small plot of land may not be enough for a certain type of species because certain species want to have a large area of land where they roam around and and they go and hunt and stuff. So, just setting aside just a small plot of land really may not do much to help that species survive. Kind of think of the Florida panther that likes to have a large area of land for it to roam around and hunt its prey. Just giving that Florida panther a small plot of land, for that specific animal, it isn't necessarily that useful. However, for other species, the small plot of land that you kind of mark off for them would be sustainable and would be sufficient to kind of help keep their numbers from going to extinction. So basically the idea is that most conservationists are going to agree on is that you try to protect entire ecosystems rather than just one individual species. And that's because ecosystems and species in ecosystems, this is a kind of it's a delicate web where species interact with each other. It's not, one species depends on another species, which depends on another species, which depends on another species. And so the idea is, rather than trying to save one specific species, let's try to protect an entire ecosystem. And that's kind of the broad picture approach that conservation now has. And specifically, when you're identifying these ecosystems to preserve, you focus on those hotspots that we talked about earlier. And so the first strategy, you got to identify those hotspots, and then you try and you also try and promote practices and products that are sustainable. So in other words, there's certain maybe detergents or something, it's kind of a big thing. Like, if you go to the grocery store, there's some detergents that they pride themselves on, being made with sustainable, non-harsh chemicals, that it's better for the environment. It's kind of a new wave of products that are coming out where it's kind of the cool new thing in marketing for a product to be sustainable or good for the environment. Okay. And so the idea of setting aside these ecosystems means that you need to have a lot of study that goes into trying to find which ecosystems and which locations ecosystems to really focus your efforts on. Meaning that the best ecosystems that you can protect are ones that you can kind of link together into larger areas. Meaning, like, rather than we're going to protect this area and these random ecosystems, trying to do research to try to prioritize preserving ecosystems that are closer together. So if we're going to save 3 ecosystems, rather than saving these 3 ecosystems that are separated, maybe you can try to find a patch of endangered ecosystems that are more closer together, where you can kind of just map off this area and more efficiently protect those ecosystems. And then also getting an idea of how much fragmentation an ecosystem can tolerate. So kind of almost an everybody wins type approach, where rather than saying, oh no, you can't develop this area of land and just completely marking it off, you try and find a balance where, okay, maybe this ecosystem, it could technically lose 25% of its area to human development, but we still need to mark off 75% of the area for protection. Otherwise, that ecosystem's going to fall apart. So trying to find those breaking points in the ecosystem's balance. When it comes to protecting biodiversity, a lot of it's going to start with legal protection, where, obviously people break laws all the time, but you need to at least have laws in place where it's kind of known that this is not okay for people to be doing. So in 1973, the U.S. Congress passed what's known as the Endangered Species Act, and it's designed to protect any plant or animal species that's in danger of extinction. So within the Endangered Species Act, the first provision is identifying, making a list of all the endangered and all the threatened species in the United States. So just kind of getting an idea of what exactly is an endangered species, which species are on this list, and then protecting these species from human harm, saying that, okay, these species are set aside, you can't hunt these species for food or use their furs or whatever for business gain. And then also the third provision is going to be preventing the federal government from using any land or carrying out any product that's going to jeopardize any species on that list. And then the fourth provision is going to be making a specific recovery plan for each of the listed species in there. And so, this is all good and well, and I don't think there's anybody who necessarily would be inherently against doing that, but there's definitely controversy to doing something like this, because imagine that you're some sort of real estate developer wanting to build a hotel. However, last minute you found some really valuable area of land that would be great for a hotel, but last minute you find out that, there's some rare species of a beetle, that if you build that hotel, you're going to push that beetle population to extinction. And so the government says, hey, you can't build your hotel there. People aren't going to take too kindly to that. And so just the idea that this is kind of a complicated issue here. There's business and human interests as well as species interests. And just because we find which species are in danger of becoming extinct and saying that we're going to protect them doesn't mean there's not going to be consequences in other areas of life, consequences in our own human development. And this is just a slide just summarizing those four provisions of the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so, there is a middle ground here, and that's kind of the goal, is where you develop something called a habitat conservation plan, where you take your environmentalists and you take your developers and you try and work out some sort of compromise. So say you want to build that hotel on this land where you have these endangered beetles. Maybe you try and find some sort of compromise where you set aside maybe even just a fourth of that land, where you can still use most of that land for developing the hotel, but if you're able to just set aside, 25% of that land to protect those beetles, that would be enough to prevent those beetles from going to extinction. It is just an example of some sort of compromise that happens, and these compromises are typically what ends up happening. Eventually, you typically have some sort of compromise that happens. A lot of times, what gets more publicity and is more interesting to hear about is whenever you have these big dramatic controversies between environmentalists and developers. But a lot of times you can find some sort of compromise that doesn't, one that doesn't completely hinder human development, and one that doesn't just completely disregard the environment. Okay, and then at the global level, there's what's called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. And this is just kind of an international leadership organization that helps to advise different governments on how they can manage their natural resources. They also will do some work on identifying those biodiversity hotspots, those areas that are at special risk of losing biodiversity. Basically, they can just some sort of body where you can pool your resources and kind of pool your knowledge, and they can kind of help advise other governments on how they can best manage their environment. One product of the IUCN is what's called the Convention, a treaty called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or the, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, the CITES or CITES Treaty. And a benefit that's come from this treaty was it helped to stop the slaughter of African elephants by poachers who were selling the ivory tusks for profit. An example of something another thing that the CITES has done is having a worldwide ban on sales, imports, and exports of that ivory. Basically just trying to create a culture where killing elephants and selling their ivory tusks is frowned upon and is not okay. Kind of a popular uproar against these sort of international, these sort of, laws making things like the ivory trade illegal is that the worry is that it kind of becomes something like with illegal drugs where you can have the unintentional consequence of driving up the price of that ivory such that more people go out and kill those elephants because it's illegal, because it's this dangerous thing and there's a lot more money in it, versus the argument would go, oh, well, if you didn't make killing elephants and selling ivory illegal, then the market would correct itself to where fewer elephants would die because it's no longer this illegal thing that drove the price high, which is kind of the argument that people also will go on, with talking about illegal drugs. However, at least in this case, the ban was effective in the fact that it actually dropped the price of ivory rather than rising it, and you did see a decline in the poaching of the elephants. Another kind of global effort was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the First Earth Summit, and they developed what's called the Biodiversity Treaty, and it's just an international agreement aimed at strengthening national control and preservation of biological resources. Just essentially kind of getting the word out there to different countries and making the idea of preserving biodiversity more of a priority among countries. How much tangible progress these treaty type things do, I don't really know, but it's at least nice knowing that it's at least formally written down somewhere that we should be preserving biodiversity. It took several years for this to be adopted into law by the U.S. government. And again, anytime you have these sort of treaties, environmental treaties, you always kind of get some pushback by certain political groups or different types of people, just pointing out that, hey, if we really want to make preserving biodiversity a thing, that's going to take, some sort of significant hit to our economic and trade agreements, and might actually affect the economy of either the U.S. or different areas of the world. And that's just kind of the complicated trade-offs that go into environmental science. There are consequences to just completely exploiting the environment, and there's consequences to just completely disregarding the economy and just trying to protect the environment. And so there kind of has to be, the goal is to try to find some sort of middle ground. But you also have, not only do you have government efforts, but you also are going to have private conservation efforts. And the biggest one is going to be the World Wildlife Fund, where they'll actually go and buy areas of land that's in danger of losing biodiversity, and they'll buy that land and they'll mark it off as protect it from being developed, and then do efforts to try and make sure that ecosystem's healthy. So again, the idea of trying to balance human needs with that of the environment. And the hope is that you can try and make protecting the environment something of an economic benefit. In other words, trying to do all that we can to make, I guess, protecting the environment beneficial to business. So an example is what you're seeing a lot now, and when you go to the grocery store, is it's kind of like a trendy, cool thing for businesses to do, where they try and make their product beneficial to the environment, or at least seem beneficial to the environment, because people care about that, And so that's kind of an example of some sort of meeting in the middle between these two things, where you can make protecting the environment something of a benefit for businesses. Okay, and that's going to do it for 10.3 and also for Chapter 10.